everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of MSP Business School. As always, I'm Brian Doyle, your host here with you today. And today I've got a very special guest joining me. We've had the benefit of working together for a good part of this year as VCIO Toolbox enters into its initial SOC 2 season, for lack of a better term, I guess. But with that said, I want to welcome Beau Butaud to our call today from Render Compliance. Beau, how are you?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on, Brian. Good to see you again.
Yeah, we're excited to see you, and it's fun to see you without you telling us all the things we need to do better.
I'll try to keep it to a minimum. Yeah.
But it's been great working with you and your team thus far. Certainly here in the MSP space, things like SOC 2 and CMMC have really jumped up the awareness into governance, risk, and compliance for the industry, and more MSPs, most of us software vendors are working to attain these certifications and accreditations, of course, but we're seeing even more and more of the MSP community looking at getting to SOC 2 compliance and bringing in other compliances into their organization to reinforce the trust they have with their customers. And certainly, in the part that I love about the process, really make sure that there are no gaps in what you're doing from a best practices standpoint to really ensure that you're doing the best to safeguard the information that your customers trust you with. So it's been a little bit of the Wild West for us in the GRC space and the MSP. And, as somebody that's an authority, I thought it would be great to have you join us today and, share a little bit of your wisdom about how to approach SOC 2, if you're thinking about preparing, and then, how to engage as you get to that point. But before we go down that line, maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about your backstory and how you ended up in the world of audit.
Sure, it sounds good. I was going to say, sharing my wisdom is a generous term, but if you do something,
Not at all.
1,000 times in a row, you're bound to learn something about it. So hopefully we can share that. But so my backstory, I grew up here in Seattle, Washington, and still living around here. And I studied accounting in college. I've worked for CPA firms my entire career. And, over the last few decades, CPA firms somehow found themselves administering this niche of information security audits. So I found myself at a firm that had one of those teams and was doing these IT audits or these information security audits, and that's what I've been doing for most of my career here over the past 10 years. So I've been specializing in SOC 1 and SOC 2 exams and a few other related frameworks, working across a few different firms. And then 2 years ago, I took a leap and started my own business. It's called Render Compliance, and the whole goal of that was to provide really good quality audits and be able to provide them fast. Working for larger firms, we saw audits done well. We saw really good report quality, really good firm reputation, but the process was terrible. The tools were terrible. It would take forever. And so, wanting to bring kind of the agility, nimbleness of a small firm, and keep the quality that you might expect from one of those larger audit firms when you're getting your SOC 2.
Yeah, I think the boutique nature of it is really good, especially for organizations like many of the MSPs out there that are just heading into their first SOC 2. I've worked in both formats in my life. I think most listeners know this, but for you, Beau, I used to also operate data centers back in my day. And, we worked with the Accentures and the KPMGs and those pieces. And really they would just send usually some young kids to come in and do our audit. They didn't have a lot of insight into what the controls needed to do. They were really just coming in going, hey, I got to make sure it does this, and you can prove it does this, and that kind of thing. And it was really tough because sometimes we didn't know what they were expecting or what they required. And certainly one of the benefits we've had in working with a firm like you is hey, help us understand what evidence we require for this control. What do we need to prove out? How much is enough? Or even more importantly, what more can we potentially do to even tighten this up a little bit more? And that's where having a sounding board like you has been great through the process.
Yeah. I think I've definitely been that young kid at various points in my career with just no idea what I'm looking at, and so I think that's been one of the biggest learnings that I've had as an auditor over the years. Is just like, if I don't know something, admit it. Don't try to don't try to show up at a server rack and you know pretend like you know exactly what you're asking for from Brian Doyle, who works in this thing every day. But yeah, if you don't know something, admit it, and then you can actually get to like what's important for this audit, what's the true risk here.
Yeah. And I think, where I see our industry, it's kind of how do we get organized, for the process? It can be a little bit daunting, right? Because it's a lot of technical requirement, it's a lot of policy requirement, it's a lot of procedure review, and in some cases, some of these things, in MSPs, I'm pointing at you guys a little bit because you know this to be real. The policy lives between the two ears of the guy that your senior engineer or something like that. So, maybe you can share a little bit about how you coach up some of these folks and what you tell them, as they're getting organized. How do you kind of level set for all these different needs that are coming in?
Right. Yeah. No, good question. And I do think it's something that MSPs, with your understanding of company processes, with your understanding of IT, like you are really well positioned to be able to add on a compliance service for your customers, or to be able to complete your own SOC 2 effectively and quickly. I think you're really well set up for it. I just found myself, I was talking with Brian earlier, we were talking earlier, and yeah, found myself having the same conversations with folks over and over again about the SOC 2 process, and realizing there's a need to make that clear. So yeah, I think that's a good thing to get into. Um, the place that we start with companies that are pursuing SOC 2 for the first time are those just basic scoping questions. So we'll start by asking, like, why do you need this thing? You think you need this thing? Do you actually need it? Because of course we've worked with companies before where they realize later, like, the thing they've been spending hours and thousands of dollars on is not actually the best thing for them, or not actually required, and they're very sad after that. So we want to avoid that situation, right? So we want to ask, like, why do you need this? If you have a firm customer requirement for this, then great, that makes it easy. Like, okay, yeah, if it's a customer you care about, you need to get the SOC 2. If you are processing or storing sensitive or confidential information on behalf of your business clients, your B2B clients, that's another kind of clear case for getting the SOC 2. So those are the vast majority of folks that are going to need a SOC 2. So yeah, usually an MSP falls into that category, right? Like you have the ConnectWise access to your clients' machines. You have all the information on. You have a lot of sensitive information for your clients, and so it's a pretty good use case for SOC 2.
And that's one of the interesting things about SOC 2 versus some of the other frameworks that are out there, like CIS and NIST-CSF, as just a couple examples of ones that I know that the MSP community is engaging in on. SOC really allows you to define your own scope as long as it maps back to the trust criteria. And I think that becomes a little bit challenging for some as well, because we might over engineer the scope. To your point,
Mhm.
not everything is really required. I can even say from our own experiences together, we started out with a scope, and then as we actually started going through testing, we realized a couple controls were just irrelevant and didn't matter based on the way we actually truly operated. So we did a little reshaping of the scope during the Type 1 process. You
Hmm.
know, I think that is the part I see MSPs probably most challenged with, because, there was a running joke back in the day. SOC 2, we get to choose what controls we want to manage to. And as long as we say we're doing what we're doing, then, we're valid. And I
Right.
think it goes much beyond that, of course. But it is funny, how scope can change a little bit if you're on your first run through on
Right.
SOC as you kind of go through the process. What do you see oftentimes, Beau?
Yeah, there's a couple different levels to break that down, because there's kind of the overall engagement scope where you're talking about what is the system that we're going to be auditing for this SOC 2 report. So if you have multiple applications that you've developed as a company and you only want to do it over certain applications, you could scope it out that way. If you have locations overseas and you want to scope those out from the report, you can do that as long as you state that clearly in the report. Then that'll be the report scope. So you kind of figure out who's asking for my SOC 2 report, what's the service that we're providing to them, um, and the system requirements to go along with that. You write all that down, and that's kind of your system scope. Um, and and then beyond that, so yeah, you want to go through the exercise of defining your scope first, because that is going to drive the controls that you need to have in place. And like you mentioned, Brian, so ultimately what you need to support through the process of the SOC 2 are the criteria. They're called the trust services criteria. Um, and so those are the standard things defined by the AICPA that you need to support. But the way you do that is by defining controls. So you actually, as an organization, you define those controls for yourself. And an auditor could help you towards that, a consultant could really help you towards that, but ultimately you have responsibility for defining those controls, how you're protecting the data within your system that you're providing the service to your customers. Um, yeah, so you kind of go through that process. You you I guess you also want to look at the timing. That's a big part of this whole process is figuring out, okay, how urgent is this need? Do we need it done in 3 months? If so, we got to really get moving. But yeah, figuring out kind of the drop dead date for when you need the report, you let that drive everything. You kind of got to figure out within SOC 2, it gets really confusing. There's a type 1 and a type 2 exam types. So the type 1 is kind of like um, the precursor, where it's a snapshot audit as of a point in time. You're assessing the design of the controls and if they're appropriate. Whereas a type 2 exam is you're going to assess both the design of the controls and the operating effectiveness over an exam period. Usually minimum of 3 months, standard would be 12 months there. And so the SOC 2 Type 2 report is ultimately what is going to be expected in the industry, but many companies, when you're just starting out, um, will start with that Type 1 exam as a stepping stone, as a really good, as a way to be really confident as of that Type 1 snapshot date. Our controls are ready to go, and then all we have to do is operate those controls over the Type 2 period. Auditor will come in, perform the audit, then we'll get the Type 2 report.
Yep, and so that timing piece is a key one, and I think I can speak from our experience. Some of our customers, they're heading into it. They're being asked more that your vendors downstream have SOC 2 capabilities, things like that, but they are open to, hey, you're on your first SOC journey. Yes, get us your type 1 report so we know that you're in progress. It's not just, hey, yeah, we're going to go get it kind of thing. That you're in progress. And then we understand it takes time for those controls to get measured for type 2. And, but I always like to say, guys, when you're doing this, it's about the long term, not just the short term. Yes, we want to get to the SOC 2 status, and obviously our time with Beau is to get to the SOC 2 Type 2, and then we move on for a while until it's time to go through that process again. But the reality is, you're building effective controls to run your business, and there have been some real eye openers as we've gone through this process around things like policy creation. When we looked at some of the policies we wrote on day one of operating our business, that certainly served us at that point in time. They weren't as applicable today as technology emerged and new things like AI came into being. So we had to recraft those policies. And this is why you see in most audits, there are annual policy reviews being required because technology does change. You may be able to look at 80% of them, rubber stamp them and go, yep, we're good again. We reviewed, they're good for this year. But you're going to see there are ones that you need to apply some changes to. And if you talk to your customers out there, MSPs, you'll find out some of them haven't changed a policy in their handbook since they bound it in 1982.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you run into those things every day, Beau.
Yeah, the technology changes and maybe more often too the company changes. You add on a new service offering, you use a new type of infrastructure, whatever it is, and suddenly you have new risks that need to be addressed by policy, right? So yeah, those setting good policies that actually map what it is you do are super key for obviously operating well as a company, but going through the SOC 2 process, it definitely helps. I know, like that's been something we've talked through in our audit is like, so I'm setting up this information security. I mean, you already had that, but I'm setting up some policy or some
Well, let's even
business
just, I
continuity
mean, I'll give you a
plan.
great
What?
one.
Yeah,
Data destruction, right?
yeah,
10 years
right.
ago, data destruction focused a lot on how I'm going to dispose of my machines, how I'm going to destroy my hard drives, degaussing them, drilling a nail, all the great things we saw there, shredding. Now, we don't hold the physical assets for much
Can't
of
even
where our
touch it.
data is, and most
Yeah,
desktops don't contain as much data as they once did. So now it's
right.
about, hey, how is your vendor getting rid of data destroying? Do you know what your vendors that have your data, what their policies are? Because more than likely, you're going to have to conform to their policies more than them conforming to yours, right? So if your
Right.
policy says, hey, we get rid of these data and destroy it within 15 days of, the asset being taken out of service, but your vendor downstream has a 30-day data out because it has to write over all the backups and everything else that lives in their ecosystem. You can see that things can be very far apart. And that's the kind of thing that these reviews really dictate and really why this policy component is such a big part.
It's like a constant exercise of figuring out the shared responsibility model between
Yep.
you and the vendor, right? Like even if you're just using a SaaS application, there's going to be security responsibilities that you have. You got to make sure you add the right users at a bare minimum. Or if you're using, something like a data center hosting service, right? Then there's going to be a lot more that is on your shoulders as a company that you need to do. And you need to go through every single area and figure out who's doing what and have that clearly documented.
Oh, I
Um,
love that part too, because that was a big change that happened about 10 years ago as well. People used to just come into our data center because they said, okay, that satisfies my SOC 2 requirements with my customers.
mm,
And now it's like, okay, great. It's good to know where the data is being hosted as SOC 2, but how about the vendor? Or how about
mm.
you if you are the vendor, right? And it's become that two-tier approach even to SOC 2 now when you start talking about those SaaS vendors out in the marketplace.
Right, right. It's a how far down the chain do you want to go? It's like,
You
yeah,
go
you have
real
to.
far down the rabbit hole, right?
Right, right.
So we've scoped now. We're starting to conduct our assessment. What if a group finds gaps. Is the auditor just going to slap him in the face and tell him no? What do you do as an auditor at that point in time, Bo, if you find gaps in the controls that you're working with on the client?
Yeah, and that's where it kind of depends if you're doing a SOC 2 type 1 versus SOC 2 type 2. The process is going to look different. If it's that type 1, that's why it's kind of nice to use it as a stepping stone, because if if you're going through the audit of a type 1 and the auditor identifies gaps, those can be fixed, and then you can provide new evidence for those. If it's current, if it's current enough, then that's kind of good, right? And you can, or worst case scenario, you just kind of shift the date for the type 1 exam back if you need to fix a lot of things, and then you redo some audit procedures and you're good. You can issue the report there. Whereas with a type 2 exam, again, you're assessing over a period. And so if you're coming in at the audit and there are gaps that you haven't really thought through that are coming up there, it kind of is what it is. Like the auditor has to include those gaps on the report, and it is what it is. It may not be good. So that's why I think a good auditor that you work with is going to do a lot of planning with you up front. Like we call it a scope and a gap assessment that we build into all our audits with new clients, is to just fully align on what's the scope, like we discussed. Given that scope, what should the controls be for your organization? Do we see any gaps here? If so, here's this list of 10 gaps, things you need to implement, and you do all that before the exam period starts, ideally, so that you're fully aligned with your auditor on, as long as I do these 50 things or 300 things, whatever it might be, then I'll come audit time, we should be good, right? So that's the purpose of that. I think, yeah, and that's where, I'm I'm sure you could speak better to how this functions in the MSP community, but that's where it can be really beneficial if you're going through this the first time, to have a consultant that you trust work with you. Because like we're an audit firm, we can't really do the consulting as far as implementing things or telling you exactly how to do things given your risk. We'll do our best, to give you clarity on what we would expect to see, but we can't tell you how to do it. We can't tell you, and we can't do it for you ultimately. And so if you need that support, it can be really useful to bring in a consultant who's been through SOC 2 before, and can really get to know your company, can herd the cats, and ultimately get you really ready for this thing.
And that's a great comment there, because there is a different, and if it came off any other way, Bo's not helped us by telling us how to approach it, but more, it's always been telling us what he wants to see. And then if we fall short of what he wants to see, where the gap is. And really, then it's on us to figure out, how do we close that gap? How do we get that information? What steps do we need to do to rectify it if one of those exists? So that point between where the line between auditor and consultant kind of blurs, I think it's an important one to put out there, because there's certainly not guidance on the steps we need to take to make the changes, but it's more, hey, that is not what we're looking for. Here's what we're looking for on top of that. And then we have to determine, okay, that exists. And in most cases it does. It's just how we were presenting it, and where that information was born from didn't exist. We were just talking before this about asset management, and I think we get so fixated on trying to get everything in one system, you realize it can come from disparate systems as long as it gets in one master list that you're maintaining.
Yeah.
And those kind of things become very simple. Like, I don't care where it comes from. This is what I need to see, is really what we're usually looking for from the auditor. Having gone through a number of audits myself, I've been pretty comfortable with how to get there, except in a few spots. But that's and that's where we've had to reach out and get some information from others as well on the journey.
Totally. It's such a weird exercise. I imagine it's something similar with other frameworks too, but with SOC 2, you have that extra layer of I'm auditing this, I'm auditing against these standards, but you're the one defining your controls and what's appropriate for you to do. So it's just this constant exercise of like, um, yeah, trying to explain and trying to think through what is the true risk here that you need to address, and are you addressing it sufficiently? It's just, yeah, it's a constant battle, constant exercise that way.
Well, when we were going through our first SAS 70 many years ago in the data
Hmm.
center, I just remember our CEO going, "We're paying these auditors. What do you mean they're rejecting this stuff?" And I'm like,
Well,
"We're paying them
that's
for
true
their
too.
time to
Yeah,
audit against us. We're not paying
yeah,
them for the result." That is
right,
the biggest thing. And if that's something I think is important to be said out there for you, for all of you auditors, but you're paying for the review, you're not paying for the result. The result is what you provide.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for vouching for us on behalf of all auditors, Brian. Appreciate it. Yeah,
Yeah,
well
I
said.
mean, it doesn't have to be an acrimonious relationship, but the truth
Yeah,
is, you don't want your auditors to fluff anything. You be
right,
straight because, at the end of the day, the whole reason we're all doing this is to provide better service, better security, and better support to our clients.
right. And if you can't trust the auditor to actually audit, then you that's pretty ultimately that'll be a worthless report, right? So,
Yep.
yeah, I agree. I agree.
All right. Well, Bo, we're getting near the end of our time. Is there anything else you wanted to share with the audience before we close out? And while we're doing that, I will be popping your website back up for those of you that are watching on YouTube. You can now see rendercompliance.com there. Please visit. For those of you listening via, audio, this will be in the show notes, of course. And if you are watching on YouTube, ring the bell and subscribe so you get notified when new episodes come on. But Bo, I turn back to you. Anything else you want to share before we close today?
Uh, just as if anyone's out there just starting to go through SOC 2 and you're trying to kind of bootstrap it and go through it yourself, and you're just getting confused, feel free to reach out. I love to help folks go through that process the first time. So don't hesitate to reach out, ask me any questions. But yeah,
And
thanks so much, Brian, for having me on
You
here.
bet. And to that end, we've got Bo's LinkedIn right now up on the screen. Again, that'll be in the show notes. And certainly, listeners, if you want to get in touch with Bo as well, reach out to me. I highly recommend him, especially for those that are kind of in their first SOC journey. Been an incredible resource for us as we go through that journey over here at VCIO Toolbox.
Awesome. Well, thanks
All
so
right.
much.
Well, Bo, thank you so much for your time today. I look forward to seeing you again. You and I will be talking way soon, but again on the show, maybe in about 6 months, where we could share a little state of the audit community, if you'd like. All right.
Sure. Sounds great. All right.
All right.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks.